The harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. Why did he use that word?
God goes to extreme measures to bring the lost to himself.
The greatest gift you will ever give this world is your intimacy with God.
The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all three inside of me. I've got the power right now.
I think what Jesus really wants is people to go. I want to be the answer to Jesus' prayer request.
Welcome to the Fuel for the Harvest podcast.
When this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, then shall the end come.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. This is Charlie.
And this is Nathan, and we'll be your hosts for today. Welcome once again to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about apologetics, and this is a massive field in Christianity. Like, we could talk about any number of things, and in the past we have talked about certain things. We've talked about things like the resurrection of Jesus being an apologetic.
And let's just define apologetics as a reminder.
Oh, that's a great thing.
It's, you might be like, what does that mean? Some of you are going, I know exactly what that means. It's a bunch of information that's like proof or evidence for, and that's partly true. It simply is a word that means a defense of the faith. So when you're talking with others, whether in a moment of evangelism and they have questions about the faith, or somebody is coming against the faith with statements or questions that may or may not be true, it simply means to defend the faith, to say it's reasonable, there's logic behind it, it's true, it's the right path, defend the faith.
Great definition, and important to hit that, because it doesn't mean to make an apology.
Right, it's not apologizing.
No.
It's saying, this is true, let me show you how and why.
Right, I think it comes out of the Latin, but I may be mistaken. It might come out of the Greek, but I think it's Latin.
I think it's Latin too, it's like apologias or something, but again, it's not English apology, it's defense of.
Right. So anyway, we've talked about various different apologetics over the course of this podcast, like the resurrection of Jesus and others. Today we're going to talk about evidence for God. Now, this conversation is kind of confusing, because it's like, if there's evidence for God, why would anybody ever believe that there's not a God? But yet here we are.
Well, let me throw this in there. If I hold up a pen in a room and I say, what is this? Probably everyone in the room will say it's a pen. There are those who say you can't prove that.
Right. They're
even
called
though dishonest skeptics or whatever. But that's just to say, you may have all the evidence and people still dig in their heels and say, I don't think so.
Right.
And okay, people just want to reject what's in front of them, and that will always happen because in our sin and in our depravity and whatever, we like to resist.
And we as Christians have been accused on multiple occasions of rejecting what's right in front of us. Fossil records and geology and all of these sciences that seem to point to an old Earth evolution style origin of species.
Such would say the scientists in our day and age, right?
Right.
Many of them anyway.
They would make that accusation about Christians, and but let's see if their accusation is accurate. Let's really examine that. I'm recently been reading a great book that I highly recommend by Eric Metaxas, the same guy who wrote that big, thick Bonhoeffer book. He wrote one called Is Atheism Dead? And I love the way he starts his book. He's basically like, hey, in this book, I'm not going to try and tell you that there is a God and that God is the God of the Bible. What I am going to tell you is, though, that there is a God. That's why he asks, is atheism dead? Because the evidence that he presents in the first half of the book, at least, doesn't support the idea of the biblical God necessarily. I think it does. He's not, but that's not the end of his argument. The end of his argument is that,
and obviously, if you don't know who he is, he's a believer. He's a follower of Jesus.
He is a Christian.
He would argue for Christianity.
Right.
But it sounds like at the beginning of this book,
he's just trying to make the claim that there is a God, and that God is necessary.
Okay. And then, of course, you could go from there. Which God is it? Which we've done a lot on this podcast in the past.
Exactly. And so if you were to stack apologetics from the beginning to the end, this would be the first one that I would talk about. And then
you're with atheists.
Right. And then I would talk about Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, and then I would talk about the historicity of the Bible. Historicity is just a fancy way of saying, does it match what actually happened in the real world? And I would use those three arguments to say, there is a God, his name is Jesus, and the Bible talks about him. And like basically that's the logical line. All right, so
and I think it's quite helpful maybe for those who are interested in discussing Christianity but are very logically minded and have certain arguments against it. And these are answers to those arguments or those questions. I personally don't feel that this is the best evangelism tactic right out of the gate. And it may feel overly complex. Right. This is more, okay, you've learned basic evangelism, and that for most of the world works. But then there are those who are really deep thinkers or think very logically or historically or scientifically, whatever it might be, and they have very specific arguments. That's when this comes into play, I feel.
Right. And I just want to echo that this is not like you walk up to a stranger on the subway and I'm like, I can prove God exists to you. Maybe if the Spirit of God is like moving in you to do that, but I don't think that's very common. I think far more common would be what we've shared in previous podcasts, which is share your story with people.
Jesus changed my life. He can change yours. Don't you want that?
Right. Literally that simple. Like when I say literally, I don't mean figuratively. I mean literally what Charlie just said, that simple. Yeah. Jesus changed me. He can change you. Do you want that? Anyway, so this is for the more intellectually minded, perhaps, or even for those who you've had those conversations and they're like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And then you can engage them in a thoughtful conversation, because I can't tell you the number of people who I've had conversations with and they're like, man, I feel like I have to check my brain at the door of the church. Like I can't be an intellectual and follow Jesus. I'm like, that is not true. Many intellectuals across history have followed Jesus. Some of the greatest intellectuals across history have followed Jesus.
C.S. Lewis is one of them.
Yeah. Isaac Newton was a Christian. Copernicus, others. Like, you can point the finger and say, well, they were there a long time ago, but they were also extremely intelligent and came to these conclusions out of their intelligence, not checking their brain at the door.
To this day, who would fit that category?
Right. Some of the most brilliant people on planet Earth fit that category. In fact, in the first part of his book, Metaxas names a few of them who are modern-day examples of those hyper-intellectual, hyper-intelligent, IQ, off-the-charts kind of people. Actually, I had a friend at Colorado Christian University in Greek class who was an adult who came back just to audit the Greek class because he wanted to speak Greek, which is crazy to me. It's not crazy. It's just like my brain was so overwhelmed in that class, I can't even imagine. But this guy was IQ points ahead of me. And he worked for an engineering company that designs rockets and chemistry and all kinds of really important things like that. I was asking him, and he was asking me, we were having a conversation, like, what do you think is the primary barrier to people following Jesus? And I said, I think one of the primary barriers is their intellect. And he said, well, I disagree, because some of the smartest people I work with, so this guy's IQ points ahead of me, like by nth degrees. And the other guy is IQ, and these other people are IQ points ahead of him by nth degrees. So we're talking like extraordinarily intelligent people have come to the conclusion that God must exist. All right. All that to say, you don't have to check your brain at the door in order to be a follower of Jesus.
A great example, I'll just throw this guy out too, Lee Strobel.
Yeah.
Go check out his story, the book, The Case for Christ. Brilliant guy who was antagonistic, atheist, and antagonistic toward God, and a brilliant minded guy who decided Jesus was the right path.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into it. What is our proof for God? I always felt like this argument was extremely dissatisfying, because whenever people would talk about proof for God, I'd always be expecting something profound, and they would always point back.
Like he's a genie in a bottle. He's right here. I can show you.
Yeah, exactly. That something concrete, where they could like really just logic sequential me into understanding that God exists. But always when people say there's a proof for God, they always go to this idea of creation. Now, maybe those of you who have had these conversations in the past already turned your brain off, as I said, creation, because you're like, oh, I've heard this all before, blah, blah, blah. Let's move on. Well, wait. Just give me a minute. Let's see if we can make this work. Here is, I think, the most currently pertinent argument to support the idea that a creator is necessary. And the theory is called fine-tuning. So back a long time ago, there's a famous atheist named, what's his name? Carl Sagan. And he had a television show, kind of like Bill Nye the Science Guy, but it was made for adults. And Carl Sagan famously said there are two important things necessary for life to exist on a planet. One is the distance it is from the sun, and the other is the size of the planet. And this prompted scientists to go searching the cosmos, the entire universe, as far as we could see, for planets that were about the size of Earth and about that distance from the sun, because it was believed that if we could find that size of planet, that distance from the sun, then we would find life. Here's the problem with that theory. It's so limited. Over the course of the last 40 or so years since Carl Sagan said those words, what we've discovered is that the list of things necessary for life is not just two things long. It's actually dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of things long. Everything from the composition of the atmosphere, to the size of the moon, to the distance the moon is from the planet, to the rotational speed of the planet, to the axis of the planet. That's just planetarily speaking. We've also got environmental things. Like if you begin to put the numbers to all of these factors of like what is required for life to exist, what you begin to discover is that our universe has been fine-tuned, thus the name of the theory, fine-tuned to such a minute detail that it's a near zero number that we just randomly came into existence. Now, when I say near zero, here's what I mean. A near zero number is so infinitesimally small that it probably shouldn't be there. Metaxas in his book talks about how he's talked to various atheists and people who debate Christians and creationists, and the one argument that has stood out to those atheists as like the really preeminent argument for creation is this fine-tuning theory. So it seems too good to be true. Well, yeah, of course. There's this idea of fine-tuning, and like obviously a designer is essential, because if there's no designer, then how are you going to get these fine-tuned details to just randomly occur? Because just one of these fine-tuned details is a very improbable occurrence, but dozens and dozens and dozens of these fine-tuning details make the creation that we currently have incredibly impossible. If you're interested in fine-tuning and more of the specifics of like what is included on that list of fine-tuning, you can just Google it and you'll see a long list.
Would you equate this fine-tuning concept to irreducible complexity or similar?
No. So they're two different theories. So
one is about creation.
One's about evolution.
Right.
So irreducible complexity,
which theoretically both are about creation.
Right. One is about origins and the other is about evolution, if you want to divide it that way. So in order for life to even exist, fine-tuning. If life somehow randomly came into existence, we've got irreducible complexity.
So what we mean by irreducible complexity is that there are biological systems that are so complex that exist and dependent on multiple complexities that if you remove one, it's impossible for it to exist altogether. And so the argument goes that they could not evolve by chance, like where this adapts and then this adapts over time, because they're so complex. You remove one piece and the whole thing falls apart.
Right, because the whole basis of evolution is that through random chance, various different like body elements of the body they look different and have different functions just by random chance that gives them a advantage in nature and this and that. What you're saying is that there are certain systems in the body that you can't reverse engineer.
Right.
If you remove one piece, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. And we find that throughout not just the human body, but much of creation and the world that we see.
Right, exactly. A good example is the bacterial flagellum tail, which is like an outboard motor.
I didn't even understand one word that you just said. Bacteria, like sickness,
bacteria are living organisms, and they have tails that look like a little spindle, like a whip, if you will. And the whip turns around, and that's how they propel themselves. These bacteria propel themselves forward. The thing that moves those bacteria forward is an outboard motor, and you would not be able to
without that.
You can't remove one single part and have the outboard motor function.
People will use this illustration for this concept. A mousetrap.
Right.
So if you take one of the 5 pieces of a mousetrap, it does not work. Yep. You can't make it better. It's not going to be better over time. You remove the hinge, and it's not going to slam a mouse. You remove the pad for the cheese, it's not going to trigger it. You remove there's all the pieces that...
Right.
And just as an illustration of biologically.
If you just sit the base piece of a mousetrap, the piece of wood on the ground, you're going to have some probability of a mouse randomly dying on it. No. It's an incredibly low probability, and it wouldn't be because the wood was there. The mousetrap doesn't function as a mousetrap until it has all of the components working together. All right, so that's evolution, but
that's irreducible complexity.
That's
right?
irreducible complexity, which addresses evolution.
Fine-tuning.
Fine-tuning addresses origins, which is how did we even come about? Because at the end of the day, evolution doesn't work without a first cell. If you don't have a first cell from which things can evolve, then you have no evolution. It's an irrelevant question to ask if you don't even have life. And in order for life to exist, you have to have all of these different characteristics of the environment, of what's present in the environment, of the size of the planet and the distance from the sun and the size of the moon and all of these elements. It's an incredibly long list. All of those have to exist in perfect, fine-tuned symmetry, or that's not the right word, but you guys know what I'm saying. They all have to exist perfectly in order for life to even begin. All right. So you're thinking to yourself, well, that seems like pretty good evidence for God, because you should be thinking that. It is good evidence for God. These things don't just happen randomly. If you mathematically calculate the probability of all of these fine-tuning characteristics happening at the exact same time in the exact way that they needed to happen to in order for life to exist on planet Earth, what you get is a number that is so crazy large. The probability is so crazy low that it's mathematically impossible. The fact that we exist on planet Earth is mathematically impossible. So that's pretty good evidence for God. That's pretty good evidence for a designer, for a creator. Someone had to put these pieces into process in this exact way, because here's the reality. The math is the reason that it's mathematically impossible is because there's not even enough planets in all of the universe. There's not enough planets in all of the universe to make it mathematically probable that it would happen in even one, let alone dozens of planets, as some would like to accuse. All right. So you're thinking, I'll take this to my atheist friend, but it seems too good to be true. And I was thinking the exact same thing. This seems way too good to be true. So I Googled best arguments against fine-tuning because I always want to know what the other people are saying. And 4 kind of came to the surface. You might be able to make arguments for another couple, but 4 for me kind of came to the surface. You ready for this, Charlie? This is fascinating. Here are science's best arguments against fine-tuning, beginning with aliens. I'm not playing with you when I say that I read an article in Scientific American that supports the idea or theorizes that one of the best explanations for fine-tuning is, yes, we've been engineered by an alien civilization, and they used quantum physics to birth our universe into existence from their universe.
And so you would rather believe in some sort of other creatures out there that we've never seen or heard of than a God created this.
Exactly. So my defense of that is just what you said. It's a joke. Well, I believe God created the universe too. Like, we believe in an outside force that created this universe by design. When I read that article, I was sitting there thinking to myself, what in the world? Like, exactly, like you would rather believe in aliens than God. It seems like not really science. It seems like some kind of like philosophy of science. And so there's two arguments against that.
And it's interesting to me that all throughout history, everywhere around the world, there has been concept of God or gods.
Right.
Like
something
humanity has always,
right,
from the beginning, believed in some sort of concept of God until more recent in history where we decided atheism was the right path, or communism took over in certain nations and said we're doing away with God following Karl Marx ideology, and religion is just opium for the masses, so let's destroy it. But it's like wired within humanity that some sort of God exists.
Right. So here's the issue. Like, they can come back to you with aliens, and you can come back and say, yeah, I believe that a creature outside of our universe created us, that some intelligent designer created us, and his name is God. Also, if it is an alien civilization, all you've done is toss the problem of origins of life to another species. So you haven't really addressed the core issue, which is how did life come about? All you've done is toss it to the next group of people.
Yeah.
All right. Second argument that they have is called Carbonchauvinism, which basically says because we're carbon-based life forms, we look for elements that would allow carbon-based life forms to come about. And you get away from fine-tuning because all of a sudden you can have life forms that are not carbon-based come about in some other random way. The problem is that elements on the periodic table are not all created equally. Carbon is unique in that it has 4 bonding points, making it incredibly stable, and there's a reason that it's the building block for life. It's incredibly improbable that you'll ever discover a methane-based life form for existence, or a different element like a gold-based life form. It's probably not going to happen. It's theorized, but so far we have no scientific evidence to support the idea that you could have any kind of life form other than a carbon-based life form. All right, so that's their second argument. They have 2 more. Their third argument is the multiverse. You guys know all about that, probably because of Marvel movies and this and that. The multiverse, there is no evidence, scientifically verifiable evidence, that the multiverse exists. Here's why they say that a multiverse is important. Because the math is so incredibly large, fine-tuning wise, for life to exist, that the only way for life to really actually come about is for an infinite number of universes with a finite number of planets in each of those universes. At some point in that long list of universes, the math works out, just barely works out, for us to come into existence.
Yep.
So they, in order to deal with the mathematical improbability of life because of fine-tuning, they said, okay, we'll just create an infinite number of universes, and mathematically speaking, we'll create an infinite number of universes, and that will make the probability more feasible. Isn't that crazy?
So they just came up with something out of the air to make it more realistic.
Right. I mean, there's no scientific there's no scientific evidence to support the idea that there actually is a multiverse.
It somehow relates to the watchmaker theory to a degree, which is, hey, look in front of you. This didn't just haphazardly happen. It's right here with all these complexities.
Right.
The watch. Who made this watch? You go walk down the beach and find a watch, or you find an iPad or an iPhone. You don't think, how did the water and the sand mix, and then the plants like were here, and all of a sudden it made an iPhone? You go, oh, whose is this? Who made this? Somebody created this. It's here.
And that's assuming you have all of the random elements that you need for an iPad to work. The nature of origins of human origins, we don't even have good evidence for the first cell. There's a couple of different theories out there about how like the first cell came about. There was this experiment years ago where they put together a primordial soup. So they put like the atmosphere together and all this stuff and all of the elements, and they ran a charge through it. And they came out with 2 amino acids. Amino acids are the essential building blocks of proteins. Here's the thing. They got like 2 amino acids, and then other experiments got like 4 or 5 or whatever. You need 150 or more in a very specific order, putting themselves together in order to get even just one protein. Like this experiment proved nothing. Also, in this, I'm so sad that I can't remember the name of this experiment. They famously didn't put oxygen into the environment of this primordial earth soup atmosphere mixture. You want to know why they didn't put oxygen in? Because when you put oxygen in and put a spark through it, guess what happens? Yeah. It blows up.
Doesn't work.
All right. So those are 3 of the arguments. Aliens created us, the multiverse, Carbonchauvinism, and then there's one final argument.
Are these 4 arguments in Is Atheism Dead by Eric McTaxis?
No,
or
I looked these up.
He has his key argument, and
right.
these are arguments against his key argument.
Right, these are arguments
okay.
against his arguments.
Right.
So here's the 4th argument. The 4th argument is this logical sentence. We exist this way because we exist this way. Basically, the argument is
we've always existed this way. There was no beginning?
No. The argument is the probability that we exist is 100% because we exist.
Right.
Here's the problem with that. I was talking to a doctoral candidate just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, I know this is a logical fallacy, but I don't know what logical fallacy it is. If you're familiar with logical fallacies, there's things like straw man or red herring or whatever. You can look them up. But
meaning
I was like,
it's not a fair way to argue.
It's an illogical way to argue.
Right.
It's not correct. It's not intellectually correct. So I'm like, I know this is a logical issue, but can you help me understand which one it is? And she said, yeah, it's circular reasoning. And I'm like, oh, you're right. It is circular reasoning, because what they've done is they've said they haven't addressed the core issue, which is the insanely high probability. All they've said, they haven't addressed any of the issues, in fact. All they've said is, well, we exist because we exist. It's circular reasoning. They're drawing out of nothing and coming to a conclusion. And I'm like, oh, that's a great argument. So anyway, fine-tuning is a great argument for the existence of God. Because our world exists this way, the way it exists, and there's so many essential characteristics for our world to exist this way, that if any of them were even just a small percentage off, life would not exist. Just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of dozens of fine-tuning details, if just one of them didn't exist in the right way, we wouldn't have the world that we have today. No life would exist, scientifically speaking. The only logical conclusion is that an intelligent designer made us. And they've even said it. They just think it's an alien civilization. Oh, anyway. So, that's proof for God. An intelligent designer is necessary in order to bring about the world that we have today.
There was nothing, and then there was something. Who created it?
Yeah.
God. And we've shared plenty in the past on our worldviews section on Christianity and others, which God. And we believe the best evidence and proof is the resurrection of Jesus. And there's much evidence for that that points to he's alive.
Yep.
And he rose from the dead, and he's the one true God.
Right. And once you get into the historicity of the Bible stuff, man, nothing compares, ancient document-wise, nothing compares to the Bible when it comes to how much the Bible corroborates real-world events. Like, archaeologists use the Bible in order to find ancient civilizations. It's that accurate. The other books, certain books don't make any claims about archaeology, but like books like the Book of Mormon, for example, have no archaeological evidence.
Zero.
They're completely the opposite. Everything we found so far corroborates the biblical narrative. Nothing we've found so far corroborates the Mormon narrative.
Quite the opposite.
Yes. But all that to say, when you take the resurrection of Jesus, fine-tuning proof for God, and the biblical historicity, you have a very strong logical argument to come to the conclusion that there is a God, that his name is Jesus, and that he's spoken about in the Bible.
Well, there you go. Intellectual, logical foundations for the faith. There are defenses for the faith, and there are answers for difficult questions. And you might check out that book, Is Atheism Dead by Eric McTaxis, or The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Josh McDowell Ministries has a lot of resources as well.
Icons of Evolution is another good book.
Yep. R.C. Sproul has a lot of apologetics content on his, I think it's Legionnaire website. You can Google that. But a lot of these websites and ministries have incredible apologetics resources.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for joining this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. God bless.